Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I want to do my third video in my series about William Faulkner, and today I want to talk about William Faulkner and history. And so I want to start off by reading a quote from The Burden of Southern History by C. Van Woodward, and a chapter entitled The Burden for William Faulkner, in which he talks about the impact of Southern history on William Faulkner. And this will be my primary source for what I'm going to be talking about with Faulkner and history today. But I want to start off by reading a quote from this book, in which C. Van Woodward more or less quotes the New York Times and their reaction to Faulkner receiving the Nobel Prize in 1950. So here's the quote. Commenting on his Nobel Prize in 1950, the New York Times complained that his South was too often vicious, depraved, decadent, corrupt, and added primly that incest and rape may be common pastimes in Faulkner's Jefferson, Mississippi, but they are not elsewhere in the United States. So a couple of things about that strike me. One is, today we've kind of canonized Faulkner as one of the greats of American literature. You don't have to like him to accept that that's true, but, as late as 1950, many people were really dismissive of his work and thought that his work was crude and violent and unpleasant and something out of step with the rest of America. And it's at that point kind of where I want to start talking about Faulkner and history. The history of the American South is ever present in everything, almost everything that Faulkner writes. Like Joyce, Faulkner was obsessed with place, and the place that he was from really defined a lot of his work. Both Faulkner and Joyce are describing a subculture within a dominant culture. In the case of Joyce, the Irish culture submerged perhaps beneath the culture of England, and in Faulkner's case, the culture of the American South submerged in the culture of the United States as a whole. Is kind of a unique place with its own culture, and the culture of the South was unique, maybe still is unique, and in Faulkner's life, that culture of the South was still a culture of violence. Whatever the South may be today, well, however the South may have changed, during Faulkner's life, the South was still a place of violence, a place where violent acts were relatively common. Important to remember that 3 years after Faulkner receives the Nobel Prize, Emmett Till was brutally murdered in Mississippi. So this is the world in which Faulkner grew up. This is the world Faulkner writes about. And the truth of the matter is that the culture of the American South, up until at least recent memory, was a culture of violence. There was genocidal violence against Native Americans, in which Native Americans were deprived of their land, killed, war was made against them until they were chased away until they became extinct. There's genocidal and sexual violence against African Americans perpetuated through the institution of slavery, a system which is based on violence and based on the power of white slave owners and others to enact violence against African Americans without any recourse, without any repercussions. And the same thing then is true of the rape culture of slavery in the South, where white men were able to rape without consequence African American women. And yes, I'm calling that rape. And this, by the way, is one of the underreported aspects of slavery, one of those things which still people seem to have a hard time coming to grips with. And so I'm going to restate something I've said before. Any relationship between a slave owner and a female slave is not a relationship. It is a relationship of rape. There is the implicit threat of violence, if not the actual threat of violence, and there's a power imbalance which makes consent impossible. And the legacy of this rape culture of the American South and during slavery was the production or creation of mixed-race children, something that also is problematic in Southern history and in the works of Faulkner. Beyond that violence, there's just the violence of the Civil War, which was elevated to, kind of a status of importance in the American South during Reconstruction and Civil War. Confederate Civil War heroes had statues erected to them all over the American South by groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution, lionizing that violence, trying to make a noble cause of it. And then there's just the more basic fact, and that is that the South was a more violent place. before and for many decades after the Civil War, that the American South was a place in which white on white violence was incredibly common and was remarked on at the time by all kinds of cultural authors and by society in general. All of this violence, the violence against Native Americans, the violence against African Americans who were enslaved, the violence against enslaved women, the implicit hero worship of the violent acts of Confederate Civil War heroes, and the white-on-white violence is all present in Faulkner's work, is always somewhat at the heart of Faulkner's work. And you could take almost any of his 14 novels set in Yoknapatawpha County, Mississippi, and you can find elements of these things in all of them. Absalom is oftentimes ranked as Faulkner's greatest work, and it is a novel which essentially deals with all the themes I just outlined above. The novel more or less follows primarily the story of a man named Thomas Sutpen. Sutpen moved from West Virginia with very little money to Mississippi. He came to Jefferson, Mississippi in the 1830s, I believe, with a few slaves with him. He acquired 100 miles worth of territory from Native Americans in northern Mississippi. I can tell you historically those acquisitions were not always voluntary, and those acquisitions were a part of destroying and removing Native Americans from the southern states. He is bent on becoming financially successful, on being rich so that he can have whatever he wants and so that he can be elevated in status and be a man of success, and he achieves that success. He marries into a aristocratic family in Mississippi, and he has two children, Henry and Judith. Henry, his son, Henry Sutpen, goes off to the University of Mississippi at Oxford, where he becomes friends with a man named Charles Bond, who's about 10 years older than he is. He and Bond become really close friends, and at one point he brings Bond home to meet his family over a holiday period, and Bond and Henry's sister Judith fall in love, and they clearly are headed towards marriage. Henry at some point finds out that Charles Bond and he are actually brothers, that his father, Thomas Sutpen, was Charles Bond's father, and this would make the relationship then between Charles Bond and his sister Judith an incestuous one. This is something apparently that Henry is willing to live over until he finds out that Charles Bond is actually his father's son from an African American enslaved mother. And this then is something Henry can't stand, the racism of the South at the time, something that Henry feels and believes in, I think, fairly firmly. That racism causes Henry to kill Charles Bond rather than let his sister marry an African American man. Again, note, he wasn't concerned about the incestuous relationship, but just about what in the South they would have called the misogynistic relationship, or misogynistic relationship between his white sister and a man of mixed race. Thomas Sutpen, by the way, true to form for white landowners and slave owners in the South, fathered more than one child from an enslaved woman that he raped. And indeed, later, Henry goes on to have a relationship with his half-sister from his father Thomas's relationship with yet another female slave. Also notice the double standard. Henry has no problem having a relationship with his mixed-race sister, but was not willing to allow his sister to have the same kind of relationship with her mixed-race brother. And if you're getting confused about all this, this is part of, I think, the Gothic nature of Faulkner's writing about the South. But here, I think, is a key element that Faulkner is talking about in Absalom, and that is how racism is a stronger driving force throughout Southern history, and racism backed by violence is a strong theme throughout Southern history, and he traces that in any number of places. So Absalom is probably the greatest example of this, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a Faulkner novel in which these themes aren't in some way present. In Light in August, there's a mixed-race man who is eventually killed for a relationship he was having with a white woman. In The Unvanquished, which I read earlier, there is a mixed-race son of Colonel Sartoris appears in that novel. This is something that is repeated over and over again. This history of violence, though, that I think Faulkner includes in his work isn't just general Southern history, like I was talking about in relationship to Absalom, but it's actually his own personal history is deeply caught up in violent acts, and those violent acts and his own family history also play themselves out in Faulkner's novel. His paternal great-grandfather fled from Missouri to Mississippi to avoid his family after he almost killed his own brother in a violent assault. His great-grandfather then killed 2 other men in violent encounters and narrowly avoided being involved in a third duel. He goes on to be a colonel for a Mississippi regiment in the Confederate Army during the Civil War that fought at the Battle of Manassas, and then his great-grandfather is killed by his business partner in a railroad line that came to northern Mississippi. By the way, much of this storyline of his great-grandfather is essentially at the heart of the 4 stories that make up the novel The Unvanquished. On his paternal side, his maternal grandfather was for a while the sheriff or the marshal of Oxford, Mississippi, and he killed a newspaperman in the line of duty. His grandfather then later fled from Oxford, Mississippi after becoming an alderman at that city. He stole some government funds and he fled from Oxford, Mississippi, and he took with him a beautiful woman of mixed-race heritage with him. So again, the mixed-race aspect of Faulkner's history shows up. By the way, his great-grandfather also owned slaves and raped one of his female slaves, and there was a daughter that was born from that rape, from that sexual assault, who grew up with the last name Faulkner, and whose great-grandfather actually doted on and made sure that she was somewhat educated. Faulkner's own father, his own father Murray, was shot twice after beating a man in a fight over a woman. The man that he beat for the woman's attention shot him twice, once in the back, and then he rolled Faulkner's father over and shot him again in the mouth. His father remarkably survived that attack, went on, married, and had William Faulkner as a son. Faulkner himself, for a while, carried a pistol sometimes when he went out, when he lived in Oxford, just in case he ran into the man who had assaulted his father. So given all this, it isn't any wonder that Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha County is the scene of violence and racial tension and rape and murders and just violence in general. It is the culture that Faulkner grew up with. It's the stories he told. It's the family history he had. It was the culture of the place that he came from. And so Faulkner's history, the history of the South, and the history portrayed in Faulkner's novels is a history of violence. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I look forward to your comments in the comment section.